Yes. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the panel, which is entitled Dynamics of Mediation in History, Claiming Methods and Media. We will have two presentations in this panel. They will be a little bit longer than 20 minutes, I think 25 minutes if I understood from our speaker at home. So one of our... I
can't promise 25 minutes, let's see. I tried to hit the 20-minute mark, but let's see how it goes.
We're of course in the luxury situation that we have lots of time for discussion because there's only two presentations. So our first speaker is Ilkka Lähteenmäki, if I pronounce this correctly or not.
Lähteenmäki. It's close enough.
Yeah. Lähteenmäki. Yeah. Who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Philosophical Studies of History at the University of Oulu in Finland. And he got his PhD from that same university in 2019. And so his research focuses on theoretical aspects of historical popular media and historical culture. And the title of his presentation today is Engaging History in Media. So the floor is yours.
I think this is the recording.
Yeah, that's fine. The recording is okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so my title is truly the Engaging History in Media. And this is almost exactly the title of my dissertation. There was a slight slip up in the end of the dissertation process, and extra "the" ended up there, and it became Engaging History in the Media, and I have no interest in talking about the press. So it was, well, it was my failure. I didn't check the proofs properly. But I'm not talking now about it on my dissertation, even though I, basically just submitted an abstract based on the dissertation back in 2019 when the whole conference was coming together and then got postponed. So I'm not going to discuss any specific media, but more, well, like Wolf thought about this sort of media ecology or environment that we are in. So, and how we actually engage with historical content in it, and with the main focus on popular media. And in this sense, popular media is highly tied to the popular culture idea, and this usually has this sort of idea that it's somehow less of a proper culture. It's not an actual culture, but it's just popular culture. And I'm not endorsing that. It's just popular culture is something that we sort of learn to engage informally on our pastime. It's something that we do on our free time, and then we start to understand it, we work in it. It's something that we never have any info or formal training to do. It's just some culture we come across and operate with it. And in this sense, I'm also, well, the last keynote was quite interesting, to put it lightly. And in this sense, I'm trying to paint the other side of the picture here slightly, because Wolf was talking about the historians and the actual production of presentation. And I'm more interested in the consumption of it and how general public actually engages with the material that's available. And traditionally, we have had this sort of historical representations as sort of singular products. They're sort of standalone things. A historian writes a book and then he tells what he wants, and then you read the book and that's enough. You don't have to engage with material outside of it. It helps, of course, but it's enough to stand alone. And that's the basis of how we tend to evaluate that. And this seems to be often also applied to popular history representations. And films, games, all that we just heard about. And I'm not sure if this is the right way to do it. But they're standalone works, and they get criticized for what they offer in them, which isn't necessarily tied to other popular representations. And this kind of keeps, how should I put it? This keeps implying that historians produce some complete pieces that are complete wholes that we understand, and the same should apply to popular culture. And this has led to this sort of idea that popular history is something that proper research gets translated into. and it becomes a film or a game, and we just translate the history. History is something that we can easily translate into some other form than writing. And this, of course, has turned out to be sort of problematic with the discussion of films and games that we have had in recent times. I'll go through them in a bit. And the film example that Wolf talked about quite a lot, I deem it here as sort of formalist explorations, because they're mainly interested. The theoretical discussion is about how the film form functions, how it can represent history in some ways. And it mainly, the big discussion started in the 80s. It's still slightly going on. It was, I'm sure you recognize quite a few of the names. And this, I'm not criticizing them and just claiming they are formalists, but this is just build some sort of dialectic with another option. And this is, I'm indebted to most of these people in a sense, because this is the discussion that got me interested in general of the mediating history. What is the function of the media and how we access the historical material? And as Wolf said, the visual media it's influential, it sticks with us. And there's, these people had so much stuff to analyze. I had to put some pictures, so I just grabbed a bunch of movie posters and studied it, because it has been going on for a long time, and they have influenced society, the historical films. Beginning from the birth of the nation, which led to the rise of the KKK once again in the US, and so on. So these are not just popular culture things; they actually affect society, as was, Wolf's point also, and it affects historical research. But film was not the media that I'm most comfortable with, because I grew up with games. Like quite a few people of my generation. I was born in the 1980s. So I was quite happy to find out that, in 2010s, there actually began this sort of formalist discussion of games in relation to history. How actually the game form functions in relation to historical practice and what it can do. And those very beautiful pieces, for example, which actually now make the argument that you could probably do historical scholarship in game form, but it would be quite different than what we're used to do. And this, of course, drew heavily from the film discussions, because film was the first different medium that had a proper formalist discussion of how we represent history. But the big change, I think, that came with the game discussion was that, the player is pretty important in the games, and not so much in the films, because in films, of course, the watcher interprets the film and thinks about it, but he can't change it or how it goes on. But in games, it's an internal part. You have to have a player to have a proper game. He needs to have some sort of, at least, superficial ability to change things, have an interaction. And this has slightly started to move towards the interest of how we actually consume this material. What's the function of the player, watcher, reader, whatever we have, social media posters, and how do they operate with these materials? So it's not just about the production of these and because in films, it's usually we discuss the director's vision and the narrative he puts forward. So it's not the consumer we're interested in, it's the product and how it's made and what it tries to do. But actually, what Wolf kind of hinted there with the digitalization is that our practice of how we consume these materials has changed, with the digitalization. The way we consume popular media is vastly different now than it was in the 1990s, mainly because we have access to quite a lot of stuff. And this, okay, well, I had to put some examples here. Because there's so much of this material now. The gaming industry is starting to compare with the film industry. And the interaction has become something that quite a lot of media theorists and game studies people are very interested in. And there comes the whole discussion of narrative versus ludology. And is it about playfulness or gaming? That's also has been quite a big sort of terminological problem. in the English language, because they used to only have the word play, which is both, play soccer or play in the yard. So you either play with rules or without rules in a sense. Now the gaming word has come in, which kind of differentiates these processes slightly. But that has, I think that caused quite a bit of mix-ups in the early stages of the whole game studies thing. But the alternative I'm kind of promoting here for this sort of formalist explorations of specific media is sort of, let's look at it from a transmedia point of view. Transmedia is, well, technically the term comes from, I think the biggest champion for it is Henry Jenkins. He's a media theorist. And basically it just means, across media, something that, isn't bound to a single form of representation, but it's, content and travel from media to media. I think from media theorists, they usually use, fiction as an example. That I think Star Wars is the biggest example they tend to use. It has films, games, toys, and so on. It has had a huge impact. And there's, you can probably come up with a bunch of cases like this from popular fiction. But I think history has started to function in a slightly similar way, especially the popular history, and especially the consumption of it. And this has to do with the digitalization, because it has, given us more media to work in. And like Wolf kind of hinted that they do different things. So we have this sort of distribution of labor and also distribution of interests from the consumers of these representations. And like we have heard here several times in different presentations that no single historical representation we can't engage with them in a vacuum. It's always in some sort of a context. And with the sort of digitalization and availability of popular culture, nobody, if you get interested in some topic, you never stop with one source of it. And usually you change media when you look for something else, a new way to engage with it, continue with the interest. So instead, we're moving from the idea of having this sort of singular historical representations in the wider view where all of these representations are tied together, because that seems to be the way that they're consumed. It's not a complete piece, it's a fragment that we always engage with. And we look for more fragments to see what else is there, what's the other side of it. And the idea is that, it seems to be that we have come to sort of understanding that no representation is a complete one. They're always just a piece of some larger thing. At least we think it like that. That might not necessarily be the case, but that seems to be the way that we consume these representations. So instead, we start to think about media content, and in our case, history, converging across media. It comes together. It doesn't matter to us how we access actually the content, and we're willing to bounce from media to do this, because different media excel in different ways of representing different aspects of what we're interested in. And we score it. We have become very good at this. And thus, the every representation is more like an entry point to historical material and content and stuff we're interested in, rather than any sort of complete description of, or an end to the interest. Because that's also something that historians tend to think that, I have written a book, this is sort of the end. You don't have to go further than this. But with the digital media environment, we are kind of in the situation that every single representation is some sort of entry point, and there's more to be found out. And this is something that has changed in general about our media environment, probably during the last 10 years, I think. So no representation actually stands alone. It's always tied and consumed with others, and they complement each other. And sometimes they compete, but it's not a hostile relationship in that sense that someone might think. I'll give you a personal example of how this actually happened with me, because this sort of began in 2019 I was avoiding working on my dissertation and started watching the Czernín miniseries. And well, I ended up watching the whole thing in one sitting. It's, I think, 5 episodes or something. It's a magnificent piece of this emotional impact of nuclear disaster. So I began with a drama series. Of course, I knew it was a drama series, so it can't be completely accurate, and no one expects that. But it, still, it has to have something right. The basic stuff, at least a year of the event or something. So, and well, I was born in 1948, so I can't remember the actual event. So it's all history in that sense. And the series put forward a bunch of historical claims about, people standing on a bridge getting radiated, watching the disaster, how this disaster actually happened, and so on. So, I got interested, but what you're gonna do? What actually happened? What do we actually know about this? Well, like every internet user, I ended up in Wikipedia. It just happens. It's the first thing that you come up when you search for something. It's just, you can't avoid it. And I think I spent 2-3 hours there reading about the actual event, the location, what else? Nuclear reactor drawings, how they actually operate, the general timeline, different reports that have been written about the whole thing. I think then it was about 2 o'clock in the night, after midnight or something, and I had to go to sleep because I'd worked on the next day. And then I went to work and started discussing with the people about the whole thing. Well, I'm lucky that I work in a history department. There's people who know about this stuff, and people who remember what it was actually like when it happened. How was the news? How people reacted? What was the expectations and so on. But then I went back online, and social media posts. I ended up watching YouTube videos, having some social media discussions, people reading old discussions about the whole thing, what some random people have talked about on the internet. And then I tried to find some sort of documentary about the thing. I couldn't find a proper one. So then I started considering the actual books. It took me a while. And well, I have a PhD in history, so I should be going into the books quite soon in this. And I don't think most people reach the books because there's so much stuff in between now. And it's so easily accessible. And if we compare this to how the situation was, previously, another series. You have a drama series. This was in the 80s, I think, the children. You don't have the internet. You have an encyclopedia if you get interested. If you have one at home, they were hugely expensive. Not anyone could access one. Then comes the question of, what you actually find from the encyclopedia. It's organized alphabetically. You have to guess if you if you don't have a proper context in what you're looking for. And the encyclopedias have the problem of, usually not leading you further. Some of them had this, more information or further reading parts at the end of entries, but most of them didn't. So either you're stuck there, or you go to the library. You have to go to the library if you didn't have the encyclopedia at home. So probably, if you watch the series at night, it's next day that you actually read the encyclopedia if you don't have one. Then you have to consult the librarian probably to ask, where can I find more information on that? And well, I would expect that most public libraries in the 1980s weren't really stocked with stuff about feudal Japan. So you might need an order a book, so do some sort of remote loan, and then wait, and then go again to get the book. So the ease of accessing information is completely different now. It's just, the amount of stuff that we can access from our cultures is huge. And this has changed how we actually operate with quite a bit of this sort of historical propaganda, how we actually consume them and what we expect of them. So in essence, my point, and this reflects very much into what Ruth was talking about, but from the consumer point of view, because it's not just that, you know, as he said, you know, there's distribution of labor, but I think the consumers have already moved into that, in a sense. They're already using different media to access stuff. So, as I said, we can do stuff from our cultures that was impossible 20 years ago. And this have led to us, you know, operating transmedially so easily that we don't usually even acknowledge that we are using different medias to access information. It's so natural to us. And it's, well, they're very well developed systems, which, you know, promote you to do. So you jump from, you know, from a game to a TV series, depending on what you want to do. If you want to go to social media, have a discussion, then you jump there. If you want to have an emotional connection with the stuff, you usually go with some, you know, narrative film material. If you want to play around with the material, you look for some game that has that theme in it. Usually it comes from this highly popularized game or film, and then you move closer to this sort of more information content. But still, to keep up the interest in some topic, you need to have the space of engagement in different ways with the material. And because of this deep variety of ways that we can do this, this has slightly changed our relation to knowledge in general and history specifically. And I think it is slowly also affecting how, you know, the history profession is viewed, because we expect information to be available. You can just simply access it, you know, you pick up your phone and start Googling. We don't even consume necessarily films in one go. We hit pause and, you know, go to Google to check something if we become skeptical. In that sense, even the way this media has, the vast amount of media that we have has, because of the remediation process, how that works, has changed how we consume the older mediums, and they had to change. That's why I think the serializations and TV series have become more popular, because it gives you also time to, you know, it's an hour and then you can freely check, but we still have the sort of narrative holdout. And because of this ease of access to information, we have become to expect, you know, popular historical representations to have at least quite a bit of the facts right. Because, well, if I can access them, they can access them, and they should do their work to make a proper representation. And this has radically changed because of the digitalization. Because if you think about games, for example, instead of film, because film, you know, once it's done, you can't change it. You can get a director's cut, but you can't, you know, refilm it usually. But with games, you know, if someone complains that some minor detail is wrong in some description, they're expected that they patch it and then it's good to go. You fix your errors. So in that sense, the popular media is supposed to also apply to what we know about the history, which is kind of nice, I would expect. But the problem is for history professionals, and this is, I think, something that Wolf was talking about also with the immersion, and that, you know, the profession is changing. It might be going back to the immersion at some point. Is that there's so much popular historical culture available and popular representations of history that it's starting to converge around itself and not around the actual historical research as it used to do. Back when it went directly from a TV series to a book, basically, without many steps. Because you can, you know, satisfy probably most of your interests just by, you know, looking at more popular representations than going to an actual research. And this is kind of worrying for history professionals. And this is, of course, to break this, it would, of course, you know, require that historians start to, you know, engaging with popular culture more. And that's not easy, you know, because popular history is not a popularized, you know, research. It's not a one-way street anymore. It has started to become a loop, the popular culture, around itself as it converges Of course, the research still affects it, but I would claim that it's slower, and it comes from very sort of slow background change, instead of historians popularizing their work and reaching the people. So in this sense, what I would like to happen and argue for here is that we should start to reconsider how historical information actually operates in our current media environment, because it seems to be that it's very different than what we are used to it being. Popular history used to be museums and books, and maybe some historian in some documentary talking, and that's about it. But it's not that anymore. There's so much variation in popular material, and there's so much of it that I think most of the consumers of historical material don't even read the popularized books anymore. It has become so visualized, and the visual stuff sticks with us, as Wolf pointed out quite nicely. In that sense, but this is not, of course, a problem, because we just need to find the corner to get into that loop, because all of the representations tie together. They're all fragments. But in this sense, it would require historians to sort of change the idea of producing some complete argument and something that ends the discussion, but instead pushes stuff into the popular media that causes discussion, causes interest, and sort of forces people to look for more information. So in that sense, the dynamic is completely different, what happens in popular history and how it's consumed, than what actual historical research is producing. I have no idea how much time I have spent, but I think I'm willing to end. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I think you can. If you could stop sharing your screen, then yep. Our next speaker can start sharing his presentation. Maybe very briefly to the room, if there are any small clarification questions, we can take them first before we can go on, so that you can well prepare your questions. We will deal with the overall, the more general questions later on, but if there is anything that's very unclear or so, just small clarification questions. If not, then we can go to our second speaker, which is David Černín. Again, David, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but
yeah, it's okay. It's David Černín, but it's okay. Yeah.
Černín, okay, so David Černín, who is an assistant professor at the University of Ostrava in Czech Republic. And so within the field of philosophy of historiography, his work focuses specifically on both epistemological and methodological issues, and also on our multifaceted uses of historical knowledge. And most recently, he has been trying to utilize the potential of history education by putting more stress on critical thinking and media literacy. And his paper today is entitled Mediated Mediators and Mediated Mediating, by the mouthful. Should historians portray their methods to the audience? And I will give the word to you, David, if you could just start the presentation mode of your PowerPoint.
Yeah, I think I have already started, but maybe it's just switched to. I know.
I think it's best.
I think I know what is the problem.
Exactly. That way it's larger and the people in the back can also see your PowerPoint. So
is it now working, or I will share the screen. Yeah, I know where is the problem.
Yeah.
I think I'm correcting it. Is it okay now?
Yes, this is perfect. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Actually, I was expecting discussion, but never mind. I'm very sorry that I'm not able to be there in person. Maybe if the conference would be in 2 weeks or 4 more weeks from now, it would be easier for me, but actually we have been moving, so I must be present only online. It's true that I have chosen this name of the or this title of my talk 3 years ago, and actually My ideas has shifted since then. I think I can now present a presentation which is less naive and more inclusive. But I decided to stick with the name, and I think I will refer back to it at the end of the presentation. So, what is the motivation of my presentation, or what is the main topic? I'm interested in the philosophy of historiography or philosophy of history, and as I think, as we all know, this area of this discipline of philosophical discipline creates various accounts of its subjects, which can be historiography, historical knowledge, or historical representation. And we know that there are many different competing theories, many different competing schools of thought, or philosophers of history are accustomed to criticizing each other, sometimes just some slight criticism, sometimes there is a strong opposition between two philosophers or two groups of philosophers. So we can definitely see that our field definitely has a lot of different ideas going on, and it can offer offer a lot of material to discuss. Which is, I think, very, very common in every philosophical discipline. This is not a big problem. But I'm interested in one specific question, because we have multiple accounts of what history is. We have multiple philosophies of history, or philosophies of historiography. And in general, I think we may believe that these different accounts can inform other disciplines and can provide them with some incentives to change, to evolve, or to simply follow some guidelines and influence their work. And I think that different philosophies of history can have impact on history education, because there are of course different approaches to history education. Different countries, as I have been looking through different curriculums, we can see that different countries have different goals of history education. They have different methods. They prefer different values, and they can also actually refer to different philosophies in order to find some ground for their approach to history education. And also, at the same time, we can say that the history education is an important part of any curriculum, because it definitely shapes our view of the world. It shapes our identity and our ability to understand others, our ability to understand information, etc., etc. And I think this is my deep conviction that history actually has a great potential for teaching very important skills like critical thinking, media literacy, evaluation of evidence and information, understanding intentions. I think history has a special place in regards to these skills.
Excuse me, David? Can you hear
because
us?
History, as we
Excuse
most
me,
commonly
David.
use it, I can hear you. Yeah.
Excuse me, yeah, you were frozen for a while, so you might have to
Oh
recapitulate.
yes, sorry.
Yeah, I didn't hear the last few things you said.
I'm sorry. I'm surprised that the internet connection is bad. Yeah, because
No.
yeah. So yeah, as I said, I think it's my deep conviction that history has a special place among different sciences which can be taught in school, because it actually deals with human condition. It deals with different human societies, and it deals with intentions of historical agents. So it deals with information and misinformation as well. So I think history has a very special place, and it has a lot of potential which should be utilized in order to provide education at some useful level, to say. So that is my motivation. So I can ask several questions with regard to this. Can teachers, educators, and didactics utilize different philosophical accounts of historiography to hone their craft? Can actually teachers use philosophy of history in order to improve their work? This is, I think, a difficult question. Then I will ask, do different philosophical approaches highlight the different benefits and goals of history education? So if I am, for example, narrativist, is my approach to history education different than, for example, that of non-representationalist? This is another, I think, interesting question. And I think last question is, when we present some approaches to philosophy of history and some approaches to history education, we can ask, is any philosophical approach privileged, or should they be combined to fully utilize the full potential of history education? So these are the questions I will try to answer in my presentation. So briefly, just the outline of the main part of the presentation. I will explore some established approaches to philosophy of historiography. I will explore them very briefly. And definitely my selection is not exhaustive or anything. I just chosen 4, let's say, prominent approaches to philosophy of historiography, namely covering law model, narrativism, epistemological philosophy of history, which is something I will have to explain probably, and non-representationalism as an example of the let's say the most recent approach. After presenting these approaches, I will try to explore their merits and how they can be utilized in history education. So let's start immediately with the covering law model. I will be very brief. I think nobody needs a big recap of this approach. Basically, covering law model is the outset of Anglo-American debate about in philosophy of history. It can be tracked to Carl Gustav Hempel's paper from 1943, if I'm right. Covering law model focuses mostly on historical explanation, as only on historical explanation, which are just one part of historical text. So it does not focus on history as a discipline or on a entire structure of historical text. It focuses solely on explanation. And just to briefly summarize it, it's just simply written: events are explained by a reference to general law, but Hempel, when he was trying to present his view of history, he also noted that general laws in history are often incomplete and not as developed as those in physical sciences or natural sciences. So Hempel mostly said that the explanation in historical sciences is mostly explanation sketch, just a partial explanation. And as it goes, Hempel's account of history, Hempel's philosophical account of historical explanation was very often criticized as vastly incomplete account of historiography. But we should be grateful that it started such an interesting subdiscipline of philosophy. What can we take from this in order to utilize in history education? I think we can all agree that explanation of historical events is important part of history education. Students who are being taught history should be able to explain why some events happen. This is mostly true of every curriculum. And what is interesting that in order to explain historical events, it mostly presupposes some knowledge of other social and even natural sciences. Because in order to explain, for example, some revolutions in different countries, we should understand what political system was there, what type of government was present, and by using some general laws, we can actually propose some different theories which should explain why certain events happen. So actually this can be borrowed definitely from C.G. Hempel's, and this is something that it's usually a part of history education. Also, because we can use general laws from different sciences, this encourages interdisciplinary approach to education, which is widely considered as valuable. I think interdisciplinarity is something that most curriculums consider to be very important in these days. Also, I think Hempel's very old approach is compatible with New Kid on the blog, which is a big history approach to education. So as it's I think still a very useful philosophical system which has a lot to offer to history education. Of course, there might be some problems because it's still too focused on laws, and this may create some confusion among students because they must differentiate between let's say laws, laws from social sciences or political sciences, and they should not confuse it with some kind of historical laws or laws of historical development, because otherwise we would end up in some area which Karl Popper feared very much. So I think there should be teachers should be very careful when they explain laws to students. Sorry, so, okay, so I'm. Is it okay? Okay, I see. Problem with the connection. Sorry, I'm. As I said, I'm living in the new apartment now, and it's the first time I experienced some problems. So then let's move to another approach. That's narrativism. It of course encompasses many different philosophers and many different accounts of historiography. Once again, I will be very brief, and I will use many shortcuts in explaining it. Narrativism examines historiography as a literary artifact created by free choices of a historian. Especially Hayden White was very insistent on putting forward that historian has a free will in order to create any account as she or he wants. According to White, also he repeated this multiple times. Historians cannot escape ideological commitments when they are creating historical narratives. And one problem of narrativism is that it has been often accused of relativist tendencies, which is a very common accusation of accusation in regard to narrativism. Of course, we can debate whether it's justified or not, but I think we can all agree that this is very common caveat. But what can it offer to history education? I think narrativism is perfect in the way that it promotes understanding of creative aspects typical for history writing, and it can very well explain historical plurality, which is something which would have been difficult for maybe Hempel's covering law model. It is also very suitable for deconstructing past historical narratives which served specific goals, for example, nation building or propaganda. And it also offers a big potential for deeper reflection. What is the motivation behind present-day narratives? Why do we write history in a way we write it? Why do we consider, for example, democratic type of government to be better than other types of government? This is, I think, these are things that narrativism can really offer to history education. It can also help us to understand the intentions of narrators, which is another important part, especially when dealing with history of historiography. And even for education, however, I think still narrativism must be utilized correctly or wielded correctly, so it doesn't become too relativist. And I think it would be wrong to teach students that anything goes, that they can create any narrative they want. So let's continue. Epistemological philosophy of history. This is a very diverse group of philosophers. I'm using term coined by Frank Ankersmit in a paper from 1986. Even though I disagree with many things in this paper, I still like this this term which is used to label some group of philosophers. I think it is of course difficult to determine who belongs here and who does not. I think it can include both, for example, historical realists like Eliezer Tucker, or constructivists or historical anti-realists like Leon J. Goldstein. So as you can see, it's a very diverse group of philosophers. I think the leitmotif of this approach is that history is understood as an inquiry, and it focuses primarily on relation between historical theories and evidence. It also explores a broader group of historical sciences, not just traditional historiographic texts. So it can explore even evolutionary biology, geology, paleontology, etc. So what can this approach offer to history education? It is interesting that it is in line with contemporary approaches that promote frequent interaction with evidence and sources. So I think many different teachers or didactics will immediately feel some affinity to this philosophical approach. It can teach us how to compare and evaluate contradictory testimonies, and it is suitable for teaching critical thinking and media literacy. However, at the same time, it can be too technical, and it is often argued by educators and the didactics that history education should not teach proper methods of historical research. The goal of history education at high schools, for example, is not to create historians, but there are different goals: to promote some values, to help understand information, to evaluate some statements, not to simply to create or to form another group of historians. So this could be a problem for epistemological philosophy of history. And also it very often overlooks ethical question. It is simply interested in some construction of the past, creation of historical theories which are the best explanation of available evidence, etc., etc. And lastly, non-representationalism. I think it's the most developed version because it applies insights from both previous approaches, from narrativism and epistemological philosophy of history. I think people who philosophers who belong in this group are, for example, Jouni Matikukanen, Polarov, or Eugen Zeleniak. It understands historiography as a distinct and highly specialized professional discourse that follows its sets of rules for asserting statements about the past. This is once again my shortcut to quickly explain what non-representationalism is. It examines warrants for statements in historiography. And as for criticism, I have read multiple papers that were criticizing non-representationalists for being, for example, too postmodern. Yeah? But I actually do not subscribe to this criticism, but it is definitely something we can see in different papers. What about history education? Non-representationalism in relation to history education can encourage critical discussion, and it can be used to teach proper argumentation and reasoning. It can explain the limits of historical knowledge, since it allows for plurality of interpretation of the same phenomenon based on the same evidence, but without significant danger of relativism. And it can help to explain the practice of historians without being overly technical, because we are dealing with a broader discourse. We are not dealing with one piece of evidence which we need to examine and digest and analyze thoroughly. But we can simply analyze arguments that historians use in their discussion. So it can explain practice of historians without being overly technical. Problems. I think problems for non-representationalism are not so serious, and they could be found also in relation to previous approaches, but we should always agree that in order to discuss some teaching as well. And also it is difficult. I see that my connection was once again bad, but I'm sorry about it. Okay, so I think you had a chance to read the text, so I will continue. So to compare these approaches, we can really see that different philosophies of historiography can help to teach various highly important skills, from proper explanation or proper way of explaining some phenomena to ability to deconstruct narratives. Those are vastly different skills, but I think both of them in our current era are highly important. It is also important for educators. It is important to analyze specific topic they are trying to teach to students, and they must identify which philosophical approach is best suited for extraction of this potential. Thus, switching between philosophical accounts may broaden the set of crucial skills taught in schools. Basically, I'm saying that for educators to create, to extract as much potential as possible from historical material, they should be able to utilize different philosophies of historiography and switch between them in order to achieve the best result. And of course, I will try to show you some example, which are this is where I'm going back to the title of the presentation: mediated mediators and mediated mediating. So example of one topic from which we can extract different skills and different types of reasoning by applying different philosophies of historiography. Let's take a topic of 19th century and counterfeit historical evidence. We can think of, for example, I know that the Karel Šíma is in the room from Czech Republic. So we can think of, for example, forged manuscripts like manuscript Zelenohorský or Královédvorský in Czech Republic, which were forged manuscripts, which were supposed to show that the Czech nation is much older than, for example, German nation. I'm just once again using a lot of shortcuts there. Or, for example, in relation to American audience, we can remember, for example, Kensington runestone, which was trying to show that Nordic settlers or Vikings discovered America long time before Christopher Columbus. And before we found actually, before historians and archaeologists found proper evidence, there were some forged or counterfeit evidences like Kensington runestone. So what to do with this? Well, what to do with this topic? First, we can say that these counterfeit historical evidence or forged manuscripts were often part of some wider nation-building exercise, and there were some social changes and some societal changes which conditioned creation of these historical narratives, of this national historical narratives. And so in order to examine why this happened, why this was needed, we can really use some covering law theory, which will say that at some point human society will develop a need for such national narratives. Then we can, for example, study what was wrong with the evidence, how it was recognized as fake, how it was recognized as forged, how do we assess its fidelity. This is where epistemological philosophy of history enters the room and can be utilized by educators. Then we can, of course, discuss what was the motivation behind the forgery, why did it happen, and how to understand it, how to implement it to present-day historical narratives. Should we see these people who produce these forgeries as criminals, or should we somehow still consider them some national heroes who were doing some important job? I think this is a question which can be asked, which students can be asked, and they can engage in some fruitful discussion, and they can think a lot about ethical questions related to this. And lastly, we can study the reaction of historians. How did the discussions go? Who was among historians who recognized it was fake? How he was treated by the community? How difficult for her or for him was it to prove his point? And was there some resistance among the community of historians to do this change? Yeah, so this is, I think I have been trying to show in this example one topic and how different philosophies of history can actually approach it and how they can handle it. So this is example, and of course this is example when we are talking about narratives, we are exploring historical narratives about the historian. So basically we are mediating the mediators. And we are mediating, they are mediating in order to achieve some didactic goals. So this is basically end for my presentation. I would be very happy to discuss it. So there is, for example, the email. I also included the fact that this was founded by Czech Society for Applied Research. So and we are trying to actually improve history education in Czech Republic by doing this research with my colleagues, mostly didactics and teachers actually. So thank you for your attention, and I'm very sorry for technical difficulties.
Okay. So thank you very much, David. I think we did pretty well considering the technical difficulties. I'm first going to ask if there's any specific clarification questions again that we can tackle first. If not, then I open the floor to questions. I propose to take 3 at a time and then the speakers can answer. Who would like to kick off the discussion?
I have a question slash comment for not pronounce your name properly, so I won't at all.
That's a good tactic.
Yeah, well, I'm new to this media thing. I'm completely ignorant about it, but I'm wondering a couple of things about what you were saying, and also something about what we heard this morning. And I was thinking, well, first, are we acting as though history had always been some kind of intellectual endeavor, and it's now becoming popular? I have a feeling that it's always been popular. It has never been something that historians, professional historians, do and then translate it into general concept. And it's then translated into some kind of popular thing. Yeah, I think it's kind of the opposite, in fact. We can only see academic history taking its shape from very recently, only a couple of centuries. And instead, the need to make sense of the past and to pass on previous experience in communities is something that is that constitutes communities from people's, people sitting around fires. So are we acting as if this were something new that came with social media, with gaming, that is not really that new? The other thing I was thinking about is, are we essentializing these new experiences? For instance, what I mean is, coming from Argentina, I don't know what the experience is like in Europe. It sounds like, for instance, Europeans don't read books anymore. But it's something I'm getting from the general spirit of the conference, not particularly this talk. But we never experienced history that way. Not in previous times. We didn't go to a encyclopedia, for instance. We would go straight to the bookstores. We couldn't order a book. So there's that. All those experiences are very different in very different places, and our relationship with media is very different as well. So it isn't the idea that the new media is giving us a new way to experience history that was not previously there and that is general or universal. Isn't it being essentialized as an experience, as a contemporary experience? This is my main question. And the other thing that drew my attention is, and I wanted to hear your thoughts about this. You said, quoting you, says, drama series don't have to be completely right. You just need to get the basics right. Isn't that pretty much what we expect from historians as well? We don't expect them to be completely right. It's kind of the opposite. We expect them to be wrong so we can criticize them. You know, but that's just a thought. But that was, thank you very much.
I'm sure.
Thank you. Are we going to do this? Okay. a slightly complex question because I like to ask easy questions and can't formulate this one. First part, when you talk about transmedia, you have the example of Shogun, and I'm wondering if you have the novel and you have a history book and you have the series, that makes it transmedia. If you take the series out, it's no longer transmedia, so it's not between genre, it's only between video forms, this idea. Is that correct? It's just something I wanted to check. And then that brings me to an argument you made in your previous work, which I was very drawn to, which is this idea of isolated or self-contained historical works. So if you conceive of history books in that sense, wouldn't that also be a similar relation in a way? And I'd like to see, again, if you have these contained historical worlds, how that relates to the idea of universal history as well. Because then that leads you down that path where you deny universal history. And this transmedia argument, on the other hand, it seems to be saying representing something similar to the ideal of universal history through this kind of transmedia sort of field or world, or how they want to present it. I can't articulate that very well, how they relate to each other, but I'm sure you get my point because you've written so much about it. Yeah, thanks.
You need to have the position of books is within the world building, because it is in your PhD, you expose world building. Yes, it's not just narrative. I think we'll need it in your paper. Yeah.
Because there's a contradiction, or I think there's a contradiction. That's what I'd like to know. Is it? So basically, what I'm asking is, do you think these are different ways of consuming, and if they're sort of running in parallel, or if they're sort of excluding each other?
Yes, and there's also a question in Zoom. It's David again. David, did you have a question for the other speaker?
Yes, I have a question for Ilkka. Ilkka, thank you very much for your presentation. I have written down two things. First is just a suggestion which could be interesting. You have been talking about games as a historical medium, and I think in games we can track another transmedia question or aspect, and that's modding community, actually, because some games you mentioned are historical, and they have some community of modders who are trying to mod this game in order to achieve some interesting epistemic goals of higher historical accuracy. So I think this is interesting because the audience interacts with the medium and tries to achieve higher historical accuracy, whatever it is. So it's this. I think for me, it is a very interesting topic, and I think it could be explored very well. And another thing is, I was thinking about during your talk, and I think can you say that does transmedia situation distorts our idea of the limits of historical knowledge? Because when I'm for example watching some Viking series or whatever, I must see everything what is happening. I must see what people are wearing, what they are eating, what they are drinking, where they are living. I need a full visual range in order to receive the narrative or medium. However, for a historian or archaeologist, this would be a question, because I think we don't know all of these things, and there must be some gaps filled. But the movie or series doesn't tell us which gaps are filled, and this distorts our idea of limits of historical knowledge. Suddenly we feel that historical knowledge is limitless in this respect, and this could be some interesting danger. Or is it a danger actually of this transmedia situation?
Okay.
I think I couldn't hear.
Let's begin with that. This is nothing new. It just has become apparent now because of the amount of media we have. Before it was just, it wasn't just such a huge phenomenon. Well, and history has always converged. It was the footnotes, bibliographies, whatever was referred to, and so on. So there's always to come here. But at some point we started, especially the theory discussions, I think, kind of deviate from the scholarly history, especially theory and philosophical history. We focused on the professional historian, and that this, I think, is caused the sort of tension we have, because with the proliferation of media. It has become apparent that purely textual and the academic model isn't applicable to understanding all of the ways that we are killing the past. So in that sense, I think I agree with both of your arguments in that sense. But as I'm highly focused on modern media now, so kind of like big picture, I'm starting to look at this work in progress. It began in the late stages of my PhD project. Well, I don't know much. Now I have some funding on plan to a project about stuff. But in that sense, I agree with both of your claims there. And I'm not sure if that is any sort of a problem with this paper. I want That's it. It would be nice to see how media environment shapes, because, well, I think for one time historians were middle-aged white men, and now it's diversified. We have a bunch of stuff. And of course, we have always had historical models, which is again something else than we. And I'm sure if that would become more different media than history, academic history. Technically, it should be the same media as doing something else with it. And then, of course, the question is for which process the media is actually better suited for. This narrative novels or research, or explaining research. I think historians, as we'll point out, are sort of playing the game quite well, employing quite a bit of the tools they have. Would that satisfy you? Okay, then Carl. The worlds. I have described historical processes as standalone worlds. So it's a parallel world. And I think this transmedia sort of plays in the sense of it does have a slightly different function. I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to completely tie it together literally. Because technically, what we seem to have happening in this multimedia fragments of representation is that all of them sort of lead to a sort of larger goal. It doesn't necessarily have to be sort of a universal history. I don't think it doesn't necessarily have to be the idea of universal history, but it needs to have, it leads to some sort of larger world that we're interested in. It is, I'm not sure if that actually ends up existing, but that is, I think, the intuition that people have when they engage in the material. And I'm not sure if that holds in the end. It might be just an illusion that there is some larger whole that they're engaging with. But I like to play with the world, and I have this sort of idea of this sort of larger world structure where you can start sub-world systems play. I haven't fleshed it out yet. I hope to do it. But that, yeah.
Can I just ask a question? Would it then be just about how we consume this difference also between whether it's a subcontent or if we see it as thinking for each other? Wouldn't that just be from the consumer?
Yeah, it would be from the point of view of the consumer, because that seems to be the way that they operate with the material. That's at least what quite a bit of the media theorists are claiming now when they look at how people engage with material in digital media environments. And I'm not sure if any one of them has actually properly. I haven't seen a proper discussion. Does it actually work like that in practice? But that's okay. No, it works like that in practice, how people operate. But do we actually have a solid philosophical standing construction that it works? I don't know. I'm interested to find out. Okay, you're done.
Yeah,
David. The modding community is interesting. I haven't had time to look into it, but it's magnificent to see, you know, bunch of people very interested in a specific topic, and then, you know, finding, you know, they're interested in the game. This is a fantastic game. I want to spend time with this, but it's historically not accurate. I think we can fix this. And they start operating it, and then they start changing the game to make it actually work like that. I'm not sure how. It has something to do with this idea of participation, which is a very integral part of, I think, in general, how our media operates today. You want to participate in projects, in engaging with material. And modern communities are one of those. You know, you find a community which is interested in the same stuff that you are. You can show them what you know of the historical material, and then you can implement it into the model, and you improve the result. It's a communal thing. You show your expertise, and someone else shows something else. It's sort of this is distributed knowledge system. Everybody knows something. Nobody knows everything. And that gives another way of people to sort of engage with the past. I think it's interesting. I haven't had time to look into it, but if you know about this stuff, I would be interested to see what you have found out. And with the visuals, I don't know if we need complete visuals. Quite a lot of the highly visual media, you know, film, I think that needs complete visual representation because it's based purely on the visual in that sense. But with other mediums, I think we can skip some stuff. We can, you know, we are not in such deeply into the visual material. With, for example, what would be a good example here? I could say you could have a purely text-based game. You used to have them. That's what I started. You didn't have graphics, you had text, and you had a, you know, you could have a proper historical game on that. So in that sense, I don't think we need complete visuals, but they're quite enticing, and they stick with you. You know the Viking helmets, which didn't exist, and everybody knows them with those horns and everything. So I'm not sure if I managed to answer you, David. But I froze again. Oh.
Yeah. There's also something going on.
Yeah, I think I was asking more about. Yeah, so sorry. I think it was more about the idea that the media and transmedia are blurring that there is some limit to our historical knowledge. That when we see full picture of Vikings, it feels like that there is that our knowledge is limitless. But that's definitely
there are probably limits, I guess. Yeah, and of course it's the limits because, you know, popular media, which we engage in this transmedia forms, it's kind of limited of what we have in the popular media, and it lacks quite a bit of material.
Yes.
There are limits.
Okay, then I think Ellen has a question.
Yeah, or a brief comment. When I read your dissertation, I was with this notion of world building. I was struck not by differences between what you were describing in these games, but by what seemed to me to be very close similarities between what is happening in those gaming worlds and what happens within the writing of history, well, within the making of historical representations. Because I think that historians, and now I mean this not just academic historians, but from the beginning, and every person who in some way has constructed the historical account, I think in a way they are constructing a world or worlds. So I think that's, your dissertation for me was a reminder that historians in their representing and in their arguing and their describing are actually creating worlds, of course, which are only seen as worlds by people who engage in their reception of the work, in an active interaction with the work. So, for example, historical books, academic books are totally interconnected with each other, and there are absolutely gaps within the possible range of historical reality. And also, I'm not sure that this was in your dissertation, but the notion of a distributed knowledge Yes, it seems to be applicable to these media orientations toward history. But again, I think it's totally applicable to academic history.
It is.
Yeah. Okay.
It's perfect.
Yeah.
Just somehow get portrayed like that.
Yeah, right.
With the history, with the
Yeah.
knowledge.
Yeah.
You know, people combine their forces. You know,
Yeah.
help each other.
Exactly, exactly. So what you've described is something that's new, but it's also something that's not.
No,
And I think we need to
it's
bear that in mind.
It's not new, but it has become apparent. And I think one of the things that led me basically is that I think popular culture has begun to resemble historical, historians' work more and more. I have played with the idea of, I should write a paper, claiming that historians are fans of the actual world. Same that we have fans of Star Wars.
I think that's right, actually, yeah.
People who engage with Harry Potter material or something like that. They have some sort of keen interest in finding out what's in there, fill the different gaps and work with material. It would be quite a playful paper.
Yeah, it's good. Historians are fans of the actual world, whereas literary theorists and literary scholars I find are not fans of the actual world. They're fans of texts, and sometimes they make the mistake of trying to extrapolate from their text to claims about the political, historical, sociological, anthropological world that are not justified by their texts. So, yeah, our discipline, the historical discipline, is reality focused. Of course, again, I know that term reality is a very loaded term.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question for David. Rather straightforward question, or broad question, straightforward in its broadness. Do you think that there's something specific in history as regards the beneficiality of exposing the methods of these pedagogical applications? So, or do you think that it's just a specific case of a more general principle that all sorts of meta-knowledge is always useful for those who are about to learn something?
Yeah, if I understood the question correctly, I think you are asking if there is something special about showing the methodology of history to students in general, and if it can provide them some extra benefit. I think it's beneficial to show methodology, but it must be done reasonably. I think, as I said in my presentation, we are not trying to, for example, on high schools, we are not trying to bring up a new generation of historians. We are trying to bring up people with critical thinking skills, who can evaluate information, who can evaluate contradictory testimonies, for example. And so some parts of this are very similar to what historians are doing on a daily basis. And this is the places where we can, for example, utilize this. But as I said, we are not trying to bring up new generation of historians. And I think the value of history education and the value of history is not only about methodology and critical thinking. Perhaps this was my idea when I was writing abstract 3 years ago, but I think my ideas have changed since then very much. I think history education should focus on multiple goals, not only methodology and critical thinking, but they should also instill some values in us. On some level, it should help us to think about values of other people. It should help us to understand intentions of other people. Not all of this is simply methodology of historians. There are some things which are coming from, I think, elsewhere, from some other value judgments or from some ethical considerations. But I think showing methodology and epistemology of historical discipline is useful to some degree.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I also asked maybe well, actually, my question would be also on David and Ilkka. For David, so do I understand correctly that
Hello.
but do I understand correctly that the theory of history is actually practiced in high school?
Yeah.
That's fascinating. With this, or do you just mean that it would be integrated in general history teaching, that these are the skills that you mean, that the skills that they need to reach, or how is that?
Can I maybe add a
And
question
yes,
to
yeah.
that? Because I also had a question, David, regarding, it's pretty straightforward, but I think that touches upon what Bev just asked about the methodology of the project, because I was wondering, it's about the applicability of philosophy of history in history education, but it also has a super normative aspect to it. As you mentioned, a lot of times it should be this, it should be that. And I was just wondering whether the theories you just described and its applications to history education, whether you see this already applied indeed in historical education in the Czech Republic. And then also, yeah, also just where does your own analysis come from? Is this based on pedagogical research that has been carried out so far? Yeah, that was just a question that I had throughout your presentation.
Yes.
Yeah, and Barbara also had a question for.
Well, you can answer, and then I have a question for you.
Yes, so I will try to answer it. Partly, we are doing this research mostly in a way that we are trying together with didactics and educators and teachers create some lesson units or model lessons about specific topics, and we are trying to use philosophy of history in order to steer the lesson in certain direction, in order to so that we can say that every lesson will, for example, improve critical thinking, will improve media literacy, will improve some of these required skills. We are not teaching them philosophy of history or philosophy of historiography. This is something I think it's definitely not for high school, but I'm rather focusing on specific skills and abilities, which are actually required by current Czech curriculum, which is undergoing constant revisions, and basically no teacher is following it because it's too fluid, still in flux, and teachers are mostly sticking with some narrative approach or frontal approach to teaching, which is I think not very good. So we are trying to help them by creating this lesson units or model lessons. And we are trying to take some advice from philosophy of history in order to create lessons which are suited for our goals and which are suited for passing on some critical skills. But we are just trying, we are creating lessons, we are trying them in schools, we are collecting data. And right now we are mostly focusing on Czech education. But I hope I will be able to produce some papers in English regarding the results of our applied research project, hopefully. So I hope I answered both questions, or I would be happy for you to ask more if you wish.
Yeah, to Ilkka, I mean, I'm completely convinced of the
Spotlight.
To work with this medium.
Yeah, we need to.
Yeah.
No, so my question, Ilkka, is okay. So I'm completely convinced. I think it's super fascinating to look like you do with the example of Černín series, right? How you developed how do you build your view of a certain subject, and how does it relate? And it's pretty convincing to me that you never have one source of information completely isolated, right? So, but what I noticed is this is a kind of auto-ethnography, right? So you just check for yourself but have you done research on basically how, because you know how this generally works? Because of course, Virginia already said, indeed, in Buenos Aires, if you walk around, you see bookshops are much more present than probably any place in Europe. Maybe in Paris you have some. But and then, so do we have really methodologically sound studies of how certain groups Is it age dependent? Is it class dependent? Are there gender differences in how history is being consumed in this way? So that would be a question. And then, of course, what I think is super fascinating is what you say is that what you just said is that you sometimes form a collective around a certain interest that you have. You join a reenactment group, or you join this kind of war buff society or whatever, and then people start to share information. We had super fascinating work actually by Raphael Verbuist of our own university, who works on Khoisan indigenous revival movements, who try to reconstruct a Khoisan past on which there's almost no material, but they are super creative, and they don't really care whether this is accurate or not, or whether this is academically, but it needs to be therapeutic in terms of their identity crisis that they believe that they have to overcome, and so on. So it's super fascinating to see that. But do you know about this kind of more methodologically systematic studies?
No, at least in relation to history, there's very few. There have appeared some studies, I think, in relation to fiction, how it's consumed by people, but they're, you know, relatively laborious studies to create.
Yeah.
Because you know,
it's difficult.
Yeah, and I haven't seen any in relation to history. It would be interesting to find out. I would like to find some, you know, empirical scientists who work on humans and how we actually gather this kind of material. Nice to have some sort of project to do this.
Nothing for a postdoc.
That'd be good. I need some collaborators when I join. That's
just a follow-up to your question. I was thinking about the same question. I think it's very important to focus on the consumption and the ways how people consume history through different media, but it's a kind of empirical question. So we need a really methodology, and it exists, you know, in media studies, and yeah, it exists, and there is quite, I think, would be really quite an open field for people who engage in theory of history or historiography. What I came across was, for example, not only media studies, but also marketing studies, because they study consumption very carefully, because it's important for them. There is a theory, for example, what I came across about prosumption. You know, it's about, you know, it says that the consumption changed lately. It involves a proactive approach. So it's something that even marketers count with, that people like to be involved and participate, not only consume. So there are also, there would be also theoretical, I think, possibilities to how to design such a research, but it's kind of provocative comment on a conference on theory of history, but it's a empirical question.
No, I think it's a very remarkable, because of course you can say as world building, or they do it this way. I think that
yeah, of course, the problem for me is I'm very fear. I'm going to find evidence. There's someone who knows how to get rid of it.
I guess I'm interested in the question of post-consumption, and so I'm not quite sure if I'm missing how that would fit into the framework. So, well, I mean that people come they know things about the past, and whether they know where they got them from seems to me a big question. So the role that media, whether the media matters, I'm not sure. I mean, the impression I have is that there must be more history now because there's more forms of media, and that strikes me as odd. So while you were presenting, I wrote down just historical utterances, which lately I've been interested in, which is that people talk to each other, and that could fill all the historical space you need if somebody told you enough story about it. So I guess I'm just not sure whether that question about consumption doesn't seem the right word for the part I'm interested in. It's what you have after you've consumed. And so I guess the question, if I can find one, is what difference does the form of media make to the characteristic of the retention of, I don't want to call it knowledge necessarily, but it's what people think that, you know, think that happened.
Well, I think that's a big question. What is the role of the media here? Because some claim that, you know, it shapes reality. We've, you know, gone through our reality through different media because that's how we see the world. And if, you know, you take the remediation argument seriously, then basically every time you have a new media, you get new standards for how reality should be represented. So what the interesting for me, I think, in media is that, you know, if this dynamic actually happens, as it seems people seem to agree with it in the media, is that, you know, has our, you know, does this actually change completely also our standards for history? And what is, you know, then a proper description of historical reality? And because it's an ongoing process and it hasn't been going on for long with this amount of media that we have, I think nobody really knows what the effect is. But I think we should, you know, keep our eye on it in that sense to see where it goes. Because of course the interest of course is that, you know, how people generate this sort of perception of the past, their general knowledge, their gut feeling of the past in a sense. And I think all of these play into it because they give you, you know, entry points. You get, as it was, you engage with different material in different ways. And that kind of shapes also your perception. I wrote a paper about this sort of Twitter project, which was made by a broadcasting company in Finland. And a school class took part in it. It was a high school class. And their response to being part of this sort of communal project where they created fictional characters into the Finnish Winter War in 1939 to 1940 was that they got so much more out of it because they had to participate than they ever got in any actual, you know, this traditional way of depicting the actual events. And what they did was completely fictional. It wasn't a real village. They created fictional characters and played them in social media for 105 days that the war lasted. And they had to do it in a chronological system. They had to actually play for the whole 105 days, those roles. So in that sense, I think this affects our perception of that, but I'm not sure how it actually goes. It's a very interesting question. If anyone has good ideas, I'm open to ideas.
Yeah, I maybe pick up on it's true that, well, consumption, we have this very negative view of consumption, and indeed what happens when you have consumed. Yeah. Clearly, a very important reason why the past sells is that it can never be consumed. And that's very important for marketers, right? It should never be attainable, right? And there's of course a lot of marketing studies about so-called experience economy. And a lot of experience economy is past focus. Of course, the most obvious example is a theme park or something like that. It's not more than that. Selling a city as if you've been in that city experience in the past and so on. And I think basically why I think this concept of, so I also have a lot of reading your word script, right? And the world building, I think, important to me, as I understood it, is that it should not be confused with, I don't think you confuse it, but with universal history or intellectual power. A world never has to be
that's the opposite, but that's why I'm asking if transmedia is what leads us to put back to the idea of we have such strong critique. That's the idea of
exactly, but I think what's fascinating with this world building is you don't build something that's stored. None of our worlds is stored, right? Yeah. If we move, we constantly, we never see the horizon of our worlds. There's not one way of being in the world. There's not a simple way. And then I think very important is that this whole idea that it becomes inhabitable. There are certainly groups that succeed in making the past inhabitable, and that's the question: what do we succeed in that professional study? These groups, of course, some activists succeed at least for a small group of their society to make that for some past, which is mostly made a past inhabitable. And they have all kinds of rules, what can go in their world and what cannot. This is in fact, and it's of course also related to excluding people, including people, identity, politics. It's a tough game, but it's really interesting to learn from it how that is being done. And I believe that certainly an actors are able to do that. And for others, that world can seem completely uninhabitable for a critical way. I think, how can I live in this? You know, it's super difficult because you constantly feel. I think I need to take this seriously, but it's very difficult for me, you know. And but there is some distinction in that world that they don't claim that is done, that there are not other worlds that cross with that. They don't claim that it's the only thing they're interested in. That we don't should see. They're not Jews, right? They're not lost in that world, but they have an extra inhabitable space that is quite beautiful in certain sense, and it gives them a certain strength. I guess it's related exactly to what some believers can do. But I do think there's a lot to be learned from looking at history production as potential world making, and definitely not always very bad.
And if I go back to the point about the consumption and this entertainment industry, which uses huge amounts of historical material, and I think there are also two main reasons that we keep forgetting. One, they're copyright-free material. You don't have to pay anyone to use historical material. And they're pre-recognizable. You have already a free brand. You don't have to rebrand Second World War. It's done already.
There's this game called Secret Hitler. You know that game? It's a board game which has basically vampires or werewolves. It's the same thing. Yeah. Man, what a brand is that? You can copyright free use Hitler. It's amazing. They have to take up the swastika as well. The drowned Hitler. And then there's smoke.
Just conceptually, as which economic models, when I think about possession and property, one of the consequences of consumption. Purchasing, and there's something about these things which I've been thinking around. At least my interest goes to the zone about the possession and connects to what you described. But sometimes consumption acts like there's nothing that's retained. Yeah. And for the historical knowledge, that seems not to be.
Yeah, I think you're right. We probably need a better term in general for this. It's not, consumption is not perfect, but I'm not sure how to describe the whole engagement with the variety of material that people constantly do.
No, so we should think of the word what that kind of engagement specifically is.
It is.
Yeah. Are there any more questions or follow-up points, especially just now? If not, yeah,
have some food and
then we can finish our lunch break.
It's like school.
Yes, I would like to thank both of you, David and for your very inspiring presentations and for the audience for joining. So have a nice day.
And so enjoy lunch. I'm going to enjoy dinner probably.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.